Hey, Aaron, it looks like it's time.
Excellent. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing well. How about you?
Very good. Very good. Hey, before we get started, I've got a question for you.
Okay.
Kind of a
Um,
tough question.
I'm
So
ready.
here's my question. Are you a blamer?
Well, that's a pretty tough question to start Leadership Alive with. This April episode, you're going to hit me with that.
Yeah.
Well, I've been thinking about something all day. I've been thinking about a client who hired me a while back. And the main reason for the engagement was they wanted me to help them improve employee engagement.
Hmm.
And of course, for us, engagement is really this wonderful relationship between the organization and the employee. And so we went to work on it, and specifically went to work on the executive who had hired me and his leadership team. And we did a bunch of things. We talked about a lot of stuff. We did some education. We did some assignments. And then lo and behold, the engagement scores come back,
Hmm.
and they're in the basement. And here's what I have to tell you. I don't think the guy got off his butt. I don't think the guy got out to talk to anybody. I don't think that he held his direct reports accountable.
Hmm.
I, and he was upset at me
Hmm.
because he had hired us to fix engagement, but this, I'm sure he didn't do anything at all, and this was just a pure and clear example of executive negligence.
Ah. Well, I have a couple thoughts. I have a couple questions, but I thought before I asked those, would it be okay? I wanted to show a little clip. It's from Brene Brown. She calls them her shorts. And I watched it recently, and it really touched me. It shined a light on part of me. Well, I didn't want a light to shine on. I kind of would have rather that stay in the dark. So would you mind? Can we watch that? And then I'd like to come back to the story you just told. Would that be okay?
Yeah, let's see it.
Okay, great. Let me figure out our technology here. And I'm going to share with everyone this clip from Brene Brown, and it's on blame.
How many of you are blamers? How many of you, when something goes wrong, the first thing you want to know is whose fault it is? Hi, my name is Brene. I am a blamer. Let me just tell you this quick story. So this is a couple years ago when I first realized the magnitude to which I blame. I'm in my house. I have on white slacks and a pink sweater set, and I'm drinking a cup of coffee in my kitchen. It's a full cup of coffee. I drop it on the tile floor. It goes into a million pieces, splashes up all over me. And a millisecond after it hit the floor, right out of my mouth is this: "Damn you, Steve." Who is my husband? Because let me tell you how fast this works for me. So Steve plays water polo with a group of friends. And the night before, he went to go play water polo. And I said, hey, make sure you come back at 10, because I can never fall asleep until you're home. And he got back at 10:30. And so I went to bed a little bit later than I thought. Ergo, my second cup of coffee that I probably would not be having had he come home when we discussed. Therefore, and so the rest of that story is I'm cleaning up the kitchen. Steve calls, caller ID. I'm like, hey. He's like, hey, what's going on, babe? What's going on? So I'll tell you exactly what's going on. I'm cleaning up the coffee that spilled all, like dial tone. Because he knows. How many of you go to that place when something bad happens, the first thing you want to know is whose fault is it? I'd rather it be my fault than no one's fault. Because why? Why? because it gives us some semblance of control. But here, if you enjoy blaming, this is where you should stick your fingers in your ear and do the na thing, because I'm getting ready to ruin it for you. Because here's what we know from the research. Blame is simply the discharging of discomfort and pain. It has an inverse relationship with accountability. Accountability, by definition, is a vulnerable process. It means me calling you and saying, hey, my feelings were really hurt about this, and talking. It's not blaming. Blaming is simply a way that we discharge anger. People who blame a lot seldom have the tenacity and grit to actually hold people accountable, because we expend all of our energy raging for 15 seconds and figuring out whose fault something is. And blaming is very corrosive in relationships, and it's one of the reasons we miss our opportunities for empathy. Because when something happens and we're hearing a story, we're not really listening. We're in the place where I was, making the connections as quickly as we can about whose fault something was.
Wow, that was powerful.
Yeah. So I just wanted to circle back to the story and to my question. So before I put you on the spot, let me shine the light a little bit myself. So I recently came across the short from Brene, watched it, and thought, wow. Hi, I'm Aarron. I'm a blamer. And so I've spent some time and would love to spend some time with you, John, with the time we have together today and with the folks listening in, to talk about this. Why do we, as leaders who are doing our own work, as leaders who are imperfect and growing and developing, why do we blame? And I have some thoughts from my own experience, but I wanted to connect back to your story, and I wanted to connect back to the question. John, are you a blamer?
So certainly in this little scenario, I'm blaming the executive, and that's a really natural thing to do, and we'll unpack this more as we go along. But one of the common things that we do in social psychology, we refer to this as attribution. And what I want everybody to know is that blame or attribution, who are we attributing this to, is very, very important in this whole idea of getting a better handle on accountability. But when things go right, what our brains are most easily given to do is to take credit. When things go right, we want to say, yeah, I provided the right help, the right information, and they got engagement scores up. But when things go wrong, our brains often, and we call this the attribution error, we'll talk more about that, but when things go wrong, what we really like to do is find a cause out there that is human. And really go after that human cause. So it's really easy for me. So in my blaming, when the engagement scores came back low, and I actually felt embarrassed. I felt inside of myself this feeling of shame, of responsibility. But immediately what happened is, just like Brene Brown and the spilled coffee, is I immediately went right to this executive. And that's where my thoughts and fixation went. And it was this: who's responsible for this? I've got it. He's responsible. So it's that very natural thing to do. So it takes. I was just going to say right up front, it takes something conscious not to do this.
Yeah, and I think there's also, as we're kind of talking about the foundational psychological, philosophical kind of components, there's that big term of agency. right? This terminology that speaks to my ability to own myself. And so when I subscribe to blame, I'm also essentially saying that I don't have any agency anymore, right? These survey results that you talked about in your story, you couldn't have in some way, shape, or form made them any better. Maybe you could have coached the leader a little bit more, had a more direct conversation, connected more often, whatever those pieces are. I give up my agency when I simply say, "Oh, I don't have any responsibility here. It somebody else didn't do this or did do this thing or such." And so, and that may be part of what we want to do, is to say, I don't have any agency here when the state trooper pulls me over for going 75 on the freeway when I was supposed to be going 65. Somehow that's not my fault. Well, of course it's my fault, right? I was speeding. The limit was this, and it wasn't. You don't have anything better to do or such. I still have agency there. But I wanted to share, as I listened to this, and I have listened to it multiple times and been thinking about it. In one of our previous Leadership Alives, we talked about taking things from the darkness and shining the light on them. So I've been trying to shine the light on myself on when I blame. And first I wanted to share, and I didn't sense that Brene talked about it, but I think when things go wrong or there's a pinch, I often talk about that. There's a pinch of some kind.
And what you mean by that is a pinch is when something stirs you emotionally and feels negative.
Yeah. So it might be a project fails. I've made a mistake. I get an angry phone call, an email. So there's some, the little poking and prodding kind of thing. So for me, I need to have that emotional response. I'm not a screamer. I don't fire off angry emails. I don't stomp around, but there's this thing I need to have. And so for me, it's normal. It's understandable. It's, for me, almost expected. But the difference is, do I quickly realize it and then rise above it and begin to put my leader hat back on again and say, what part of this do I own? Where can I learn and grow? How do I help facilitate the path forward? Or do I simply stay in blame mode? When I stay in blame mode, I'm not a leader. I'm a victim or a martyr or some of the above. So I might just suggest, as we're talking through this, back to Covey's separating the stimulus and the response. If in between here, I need to vent, as we say, a little bit, if I need to fall to Aarron the blamer for a moment or two, okay. I'll give others that grace. But I will also expect myself and those who I trust and those that care about me to say, okay, Aarron, enough, we got it. Now what, right? Aarron, will you rise above? Because if you're going to stay on the victim, blame, martyr route, then I want to go somewhere else. So that was one of the things that just occurred to me as I listened to it. I don't think I will find a place in my life where blame has completely left me. I do think I can find a place in my life where I disgorge that, and then I quickly put my leader hat back on.
Isn't it interesting that in the little video that she actually, pulls a page from Alcoholics Anonymous, hi, I'm John, I'm a blamer.
Yeah.
And what you just talked about, I think, is so fundamentally important is to recognize it. And because I think that we get used to blaming in a way that we don't recognize it. So, for example, blame has become a national pastime. So as soon as something, we get a discomfort, what you're calling a pinch, or something doesn't agree with us, or something may challenge our life in some way, shape, or form, the national pastime is to identify a culprit and start heaping blame on them. And this is just so prolific. And I think what we have to be careful of, and I think as leaders, one of the things that we have to notice is that when people are fed a steady diet of this through the media outlets and through social media, this, when you're uncomfortable, find someone to blame. When our people are so steeped in that it is likely that will flow over into our businesses. That's going to be part of what our people are doing. And I think one of the things that gets back to your first suggestion, which is really to recognize blame in yourself, is really to begin to know that it's going to be there, to know that it's a national pastime right now, and to shine a light on it.
Yeah. One of the other things that really stood out to me as I've watched the video and thought about it a number of different times is that also blame can be a conscious or subconscious tool to either deflect responsibility, Brene talks about it in the form of accountability, or to deflect conflict. So, you know, if John and I are having conflict over something, it's easy for me to just, from half the nation away, blame John for not listening, checking his email, understanding what I'm trying to say, the list goes on. The harder thing would be to just get him on the phone or a Zoom or a Teams or a GoToMeeting and whatever and say, well, I'm really frustrated right now. And I'd like to talk through it. Because that part goes back to me having to own something. Even if it's just owning, picking up the phone, or owning that because you and I are in a business relationship together, that there will be conflict and one of us has to go first to kind of tie in Lencioni's part of trust. But I think blame also becomes permission to deflect our own responsibility and to avoid conflict. Because on the other side of conflict is resolution.
But you don't get to the resolution without going through the conflict.
Yeah, I don't get chocolate chip cookies without breaking some eggs, right?
Right.
And I remember vividly as a kid wanting to make cookies and things. And one time I made chocolate chip cookies, and I don't know how, but I know it happened because my mom tells the story all the time. I substituted sugar for salt. And my father was furious. And of all things, my mother, for those that know my story, for all things, my mother stood up to me and she said to my dad, he was just trying. That's how you learn. But so you don't get to the other side. You don't get to resolution. You don't get to clearing the air. You don't get to, you know, maybe Brene and her husband needed to have this conversation that says, you committed to be home by 10. You weren't home by 10. I'm really frustrated about that. Was that underneath the piece that said, damn, Steve?
Yeah. So that gets back to what we talked about last time, which is, you know, the most difficult conversation is the one you don't want to have. And we usually delay that until there's something that sort of erupts, and then we wind up in this place. I wanted to go back, though, because you were holding me accountable for being a blamer. And I wanted to go back to that scenario for just a minute.
Great.
One of the things that happens and is really common, and I really want leaders to understand this, is this tendency of what we call the attribution error. And typically and this is just like a cognitive bias, it's kind of a logic flaw, is that we have a tendency when something goes wrong to attribute it to a personality rather than a situation. or a process or a structure. And it feels better to us to be able to zero in and just put the onus on a human than it is to actually step back and look at the complexity. So, and along with this, so when the engagement scores came back, and the leader reached out to me, he was feeling really bad, and immediately what my brain wants to do is to find the simplest solution. And it is simply because I can point at him and then I can name it. Let's say his name was Bill. Then I can just point at Bill and I can say the cause is Bill. But if I'm really to look at did the training or preparation that I brought match the real need? Is there more complex issues underneath that we hadn't uncovered? All of those are getting at more of a situational, a structural, a process cause than the human cause. And one of the great examples of this, and we talk about this in the Leadership Academy a lot, is that when the 9/11 Commission did its broad study of the September 11th terrorist attacks, it was really interesting because it winds up giving about 97 recommendations. And when it looks for a cause of what happened in 9/11, it does not blame the CIA, it doesn't blame the administration, it doesn't blame any human beings. Instead, it blames something that's very fascinating, Aarron. It blames a failure of imagination. And it said that the real blame for 9/11 was simply that collectively as a nation, our imagination was not broad enough. So this gets to we have this sort of attribution error where we want to blame a person, not a situation, a structure, or a process. But it also gets at looking for what we call the single cause fallacy. The single cause fallacy is when something goes wrong, and you see this rampant in the nation today. When we have something that happens like the issues that are going on with law enforcement now, or we have issues that may be around the pandemic, what we find we want to do is find a single cause. Well, it's just this other party. If this other party wasn't doing it, everything would be fine. And I want leaders to really recognize that when you're dealing with issues and shortcomings or things that don't work out, that simply looking for a single cause will often send you down the path of the blame game.
Yeah. Wow. You also made me think of another item that I wanted to weave in. And you mentioned cognitive biases. So my encouragement for myself and for those listening in is to recognize that we do have cognitive biases. And so one of them is the affirmation bias, where when I fall into blame mode, I'm going to go find other people that will agree with me. So again, almost giving me the pass, that affirmation, that confirmation that says, you're right, Aarron. You don't have any ownership here. It's the whatever it happens to be. But as leaders, we need to rise above that.
Yes.
So as leaders, we simply need to recognize we're still human beings. We weren't made, we weren't produced in some leader factory. We're human beings. And so often we as leaders have many flaws, and those flaws become more and more exposed as we expose ourselves more as we lead. And so let's simply recognize that blame might be a go-to place for us, but we'll rise above it. And that we may, because of cognitive biases, want to immediately go to some of those places. And I might also suggest that I think leaders are too often afraid, and we just won't own our fear. We won't talk about it. We won't think about it. We won't talk to a mentor, a friend, a colleague. Simon Sinek, in one of his many wonderful TED Talks, talks about fear in the terms of safety in an organization or safety in ourselves. When I feel safe, Brene would call it my ability to be vulnerable. When I feel like I can be vulnerable, safe, or I don't feel afraid, then I probably won't blame very much, because my natural response, to quote Simon Sinek, the natural response when we feel safe is to trust and cooperate. Or said differently, when I don't feel safe, when I don't feel vulnerable, when I feel fear, my natural response, protect, shields up, right? Red alert for all of our Star Trek folks. And part of my shield is blame, right? It bounces off. Can't stick to Aarron, bounces off. Versus saying, I may not own all of this, but I do own some of this.
Yeah, so that's where I wanted to get to. So I love that you brought that up. You know, she, in the little video clip, she says that, and I hadn't thought about this until I first watched that, was that blame is the discharge of uncomfortable feelings. And she's upset because she's spilled her coffee. The morning isn't going the way she wants it to. All of those kinds of things. And there is this desire to discharge uncomfortable feelings. And of course, as you bring up fear, all of this gets back to this whole ongoing journey of bringing more awareness to our own emotional life. So the fancy word, of course, is emotional intelligence, and it gets taught in all kinds of ways. But I'd like, our listeners not to necessarily just be stuck on that fancy term, but to really say, do I fully understand what's going on with me emotionally? So when I do feel the pinch, or I do feel that uncomfortableness, can I pause long enough to say, what am I feeling? Am I feeling afraid? Am I feeling pissed off? Am I feeling scared? Am I feeling, a sense of shame? So let me tell you, in this scenario that I painted, when the scores came back, what I was really feeling deep inside was my own failure. Because I felt that a sense of responsibility to help this organization improve that. And rather than deal with that, one of the responses I could have is to go blame that executive. But if I'm going to be a mature leader, what I'm going to do is notice that emotion rippling through my body. And what I need to do is pause and say, what is that emotion? What is that? Is it that feeling of shame and guilt that I feel in terms of my own failure? And can I learn from that emotional charge that I'm getting at that time? And once I'm in touch with that, it will enable me to really make a different kind of a response. But what I think is so important is we're blessed with these emotional charges that course through our bodies. And often the negative ones don't feel good. They don't feel good at all. But one of the things that you and I have been learning a lot about is how important these emotional charges are as teachers.
Yeah.
These teachers show up to say, wow, John, did you really fail? Was this a colossal error, or was this just that maybe the survey timing came before the work was done? And so it's really understanding that emotional feeling, and I just wanted to point that out.
Well, you mentioned emotional intelligence, and I think the framework may be a helpful tool for our listeners. As you well know, there's typically 4 frames we think of in emotional intelligence. So imagine we had one more window open here in our Zoom meeting today. And so maybe in our top left window, we might have my ability to recognize my own emotions. How exactly am I feeling today? And John, you often tell about your work with veterans of different wars, of law enforcement officials in some of the most urban, desolate kind of environments who, or EMS individuals, public safety individuals as a whole. That is, we think about emotions in almost a bell-shaped curve, where 80% of our emotions live in the middle, from feeling a little happy to a little sad, but they're kind of here in the middle to the extremes, being very upset and very low. That often they don't feel any of the middle. It's only the extremes. So our first part of blame might just be to pause and say, what am I feeling right now? Yes, I get the blame. I'm there in the blame. But if I might slow myself, I need to slow myself down a little bit, a lot probably, and just say, what's underneath that? What's underneath the blame? What am I feeling right now?
Well, I would recommend even before that, if we're going to deal with that first quadrant of emotional intelligence, which is really being in touch with what I'm feeling, is don't wait until there's an extreme feeling.
Mm-hmm.
But to start to say, so typically first responders, people who've been involved in emergency services or the military, one of the things that makes you really good at this work is to be able to wall off a connection to emotion. So one of the things that is great for leaders to do is, even in times when they're not feeling the extremes, to say, what am I feeling? Can I just pause? And often when I ask people that question, if they're not in the extremes, they'll say, nothing, not feeling anything. And yet there is typically an emotion inside of us. So would it be more positive? Am I feeling sort of content? Am I feeling joy? Am I feeling a sense of calm and peace? Am I feeling a little bit agitated? Am I feeling a little bit stressed? Am I feeling maybe a tad bit angry? Well, what am I feeling? Because if we can early on tap into the feelings, we won't need the extremes. So that's kind of the first quadrant, is really getting good at just recognizing what's going on in the emotional being.
Yeah. Which really lays the foundation for that next part that really says, can I regulate my emotions? So can I catch it on the uptick? Or do I only can I go, wow, my palm, and the tummy, and I feel a little flush, whatever. But can I catch it as, imagine the roller coaster, and for all that have ever been on the roller coaster, right? When you first, and the cog wheel catches the bottom of the car and you get that first little jerk and you're on your way up. Can you catch it then? And can you say, what am I going to do? What are my own coping mechanisms? Do I push myself back, go take a quick walk? Do I find a trusted friend and colleague? Do I just, go grab a soda, a coffee, a water, whatever? What are those coping mechanisms that I've developed? And a common question I get, and maybe John, you get one, is, well, what should they be? That's the work we all have to do. The coping mechanisms we all joke about. And I think when we joke, I think there's some truth underneath the joke, is the coping mechanisms are the alcohol, the tobacco, those kinds of things. And I think, unfortunately, those begin and grow. But what are those healthy coping mechanisms that I do when I first, if there's 0 to 10, when I'm at about a 2 or a 3, I can go, there's something right now. What about this email? I feel something. Am I feeling anxiety, anger, distrust, fear? And then I have a method to do something about it, other than the method we're talking about, which is blame. Because that's the method we're talking about. I feel something, I recognize it consciously or subconsciously, and the coping strategy is blame.
So
We
what
like to use others.
right, so what you're talking about in this second frame is really working with the expression of emotions. How am I able to express them? And what we don't want to happen is we don't want the emotions ignored. We want them recognized, but then recognized soon enough so that we find an appropriate expression of them. And great emotional health and great maturity in leadership. So one of the things that we say about leaders is that leaders really understand what's going on inside of them, and the mature ones, even, it isn't that they're not going to get angry. It's not that they're going to get afraid. All of those, that's just the natural emotional hardware inside of yourself working. The question is, what will you do with those strong emotions, and have you developed ways in which you express those emotions and find ways to deal with those emotions that are generative rather than destructive?
Yeah.
And of course, that brings us to the third one, which is really, Aarron gets to this story. Because what happened when the leader called me and said that the engagement scores were in the toilet and way down, what I should have done in retrospect was be a better reader of his emotions.
Read the room.
Right. And what I knew is that he was experiencing a great sense of fear, because he happened to work in a system where engagement scores were king, and where his performance was being evaluated on the engagement scores. And so that third element is really being able to read those emotions in others. And often for us as leaders, that is about creating some space to simply allow empathy to arise out.
Yeah.
And when we need to in those emotionally charged situations, it's easy for us to just get caught up in our own emotional hardware that's going on. But being able to see that, wow, this guy was afraid. He was likely feeling some shame and guilt. And what I needed to do was just be open to reading and finding some empathy for where he was emotionally at that point.
Yeah, and I think that that third pane of the window can show up in a lot of different ways. Kind of connected to John's question. It can also show up often for me when, instead of turning these on, I turn this on. I know that's a big shock for you, John. I know you probably didn't know that about me. So I want to fix it.
Yeah.
So reading the room is that recognition at the emotional level, not this thing, unfortunately. Analytic and reasoning says, oh, well, let me think about the 6-axis of deviation and how of this with the time on task, the unit hour utilization divided by the, to have sensed those things. And of course, that becomes increasingly difficult when we're talking over a phone or we have masks on and all of those kinds of pieces. Because once we can read the room, then we have this ability to be able to modify my response based on what I perceive the need of the other person to be. And so I can't do any of that if I don't understand my own emotions and I'm not regulating them.
And so let's just talk about this for a second. What might I do if I'm on the other side? And is there a way in which if I'm Steve and Brene Brown's little little video. If I'm Steve, you notice Steve hung up the phone.
Yeah.
And what if,
I gotta tell you, every time I watch that, I think, and John knows my wife, Michelle, I just think she'd break me in half. She'd bury the body and you wouldn't know where it was. I couldn't imagine. I didn't know if hanging up the phone was an option. Sorry.
well, and you know, and John's question is really getting to this: what happens when we as leaders are simply explaining the situation and the background on something, but people are hearing blame. And I think that that's that. I mean, what do you think about that? So if really, let's just say for discussion's sake that Brene is not blaming Steve, she's simply explaining to Steve the historical background. I thought you'd be home at 10. I was going to get some more sleep, but I didn't get enough sleep, and now I'm pretty up on the wrong side of the bed and grumpy and crabby. And what do we do as leaders when we feel like, when we're quick to accept blame and to hear blame when somebody's just offering an explanation?
Yeah, my sense is that if I'm understanding how I'm feeling at the moment and I'm regulating my emotions and I'm reading the room, and so I love how John, in his comment, thought, to me, is sharing, when I'm reading the room, I'm sensing something from these other people. I might encourage to just pause. Hey, John, can I just pause for a moment? As I was kind of explaining the history of this situation, I'm wondering if that's not what you were looking for. Or, John, I'm wondering if my explanation might be frustrating you. If it is, could you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah.
I think it's just a good spot to stop when I'm reading the room and responding to others, because as we well know, 90+% of the things that we work on as leaders, on the surface, it's this, but it's really this thing underneath.
So if the troops are feeling blamed, there's some emotional juice there, right? Yeah. And what we want all of you leaders to understand is that if you're building a great leadership team or you're building a great organizational team, one of the things to pay attention to is where there's emotion, there's juice, and there's usually something important. So if people are feeling blame, or if people blamed, or if people are feeling put down, if they're feeling being lectured to, all of that, and you sense this sort of current, this buzz going on in the room, that's a wonderful opportunity to find out. Because here's what you're trying to do. If leadership is about influence, and especially if we're leading during adverse times where we're trying to get people to follow us in difficult circumstances, one of the key things we want to understand is the emotional makeup of what's going on and what's beneath. Usually, when we go out and do ride-alongs and meet with crews in EMS organizations, we hear two things. Two common things is management doesn't care about us and management doesn't listen to us. And those are simply perceptions. But what we typically find is there are many, many things underneath that. On the surface, that's sort of how they say it. But underneath it are a lot of things. So when you sense, as you're in this third pane, reading emotion in other people, it will take you to the fourth pane, which is to say, how do I take all the other three, my own recognition of my emotions, my ability to regulate my emotions, and then be able to read emotions in others, and then leverage all of that into better relationships. And recognizing, and one of the things that I loved in the picture, in the graphic of this discharge of discomfort, is kind of like vomit being thrown out there. And often strong negative emotion feels like vomit And one of the things we as leaders should do is we definitely want our people to grow up and we want them to be able to regulate. But when we have lots of emotion in our organization, especially negative emotion, it's important that we get a handle on it and are able to expunge it. We're able to get that because negative emotion that's not dealt with turns into toxicity.
I also think part of this is accepting what I believe to be a truth of leadership, which is as leaders, we're always going to have the spotlight on us or the target on us, depending on which version you want to use. So I go back to you're talking about there might be some juice behind something, and immediately the person starts attacking you. And then, of course, the natural is to go into blame and start attacking back. But if we can understand our own emotion and regulate them, then we can begin to read others and respond to it. It just happened to me at lunch today. A bunch of us sitting around the table. There's some new employees that are going through their general orientation. Some of my leadership team is there. And they were talking about how one of the next things that our brand new EMTs, so brand new to being an EMT, brand new to our service, are going to do is practice with the ultrasound. Now, that's a skill in our organization that only paramedics do. We do it for 3 very specific things. And so I simply asked, turned to our clinical people and simply said, hey, can you connect the dots for me? How training our brand new EMTs on ultrasound makes sense. Because, of course, right out after field training, we're shooting for competency. Can they do the job? And then as they grow in their career and profession, then we're shooting for proficiency. Not only do they know what to do and how to do it, but they know why to do it. And then after proficiency, we're working towards mastery. So not only do they know what to do and how to do it and why to do it, but now they really can understand all of the multiple disease processes going on and really maximize it. So right away, one of the brand new EMTs said, so you don't think EMTs should do ultrasound? Right? Target. So right away, I wanted to disgorge how I was feeling, which is, really? I can't just ask a simple question. If I ask a question, blah. So I realized that I have a target on my forehead and just said, hey, thanks for asking that. Clearly, that's how you felt when I said what I said. Not at all. What I was simply wondering is when exposure to ultrasound fits in this journey that you're going to be on. Oh, okay. Because pausing to read the room immediately told me this particular person felt offended that somehow EMTs were unworthy, just drivers kind of thing. And so I needed to set aside, I'm the target, the spotlight's on top of me if I don't say everything perfect at every moment. And you know what, John? That's the case.
Yeah.
When I signed up for this job, if it was in the very fine print and the duties as assigned, is indeed my actions and behaviors will be scrutinized all the time.
So what I love about even today and your lunch is you're what, 20 years into your leadership journey or more, is that this whole discussion around blame is really a discussion about maturity. Because what the job of leader to stand out in front with and say, hey, everybody, go this way, or ask the tough question, have the vision for the organization, inspire people to follow you. All of that is about risk. But here's the deal, is that, and we've said this before, that many of the EMS organizations that we work with have great management. The trucks get out, things, supplies get stocked, people get hired, charts get filled out, bills get sent out. But what is missing in a lot of the organization is what you're talking about is a kind of courageous leadership.
Yeah.
And courageous leadership isn't about being risky. Courageous leadership is about putting down deep roots in growing your own maturity. And what we mean by maturity is really finding an inner confidence that's grounded in a knowledge of who you are, of what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, and then your own ability to continually be learning from everyday experiences.
Yeah.
And it's that amazing what we see. The real leaders emerge if genuine leadership is transformational leadership, where people follow you not because you're an authority figure or they have to. They follow you because you have a great destination that you're headed to. You have the internal character that they admire, and you've created a relationship with them where they feel respected. Then people automatically want to follow you. And that emerges from a deep sense of your own maturity. And what I got from my experience, Aarron, was I fortunately quickly grabbed hold of my own response and did not mirror what I shared with you back to that executive. But what I really learned is that when it comes to attribution error and my own wanting to blame others, is that I just need to look a little deeper. I need to say, wait a minute. It's easy to go and blame the executive, but what about the complexity here? And that's the other part about leadership maturity. Great leaders don't live in black and white. They learn to navigate the grays. And even though our political system today is all about being this or this, what we have to do as leaders is really work in all of the shades of gray.
And when you say maturity, I often translate it in my mind to almost kind of action, which is great leaders do their own work. And if we leave all of you with nothing else other than this, you have to do your own work. It's interesting. We don't question that if we were going to run a marathon, that we might have to practice running a little bit. If we were going to paint, we might have to practice painting a little bit. If we're going to run an ACLS code, we might have to practice ACLS a little bit, or patient assessment, or 12-lead EKG interpretation. But it seems like this acceptance that to do something like leadership also requires work. Maturity requires work.
Yeah.
And that's the work we need to do. Whether it's being able to have the difficult conversation, being able to recognize when blame shows up in you and fear shows up in you and immaturity shows up in you and all of those pieces. Because they show up in me all the time. The work that I have to do is to be able to recognize them before they come spilling out. Yeah. It's the brain mouth filter, is to be able to know that there's all kinds of good things in me, but there's also things that need work.
So the all kinds of good things in me and things that need work. What my one last thing for leaders is that, I know you and I frequently see this in our work with leaders all over the nation, is that a tendency for many leaders is to inordinately blame themselves. And that is as destructive as inordinately blaming others. And when you simply blame yourself and are hard on yourself, you will thwart your own growth and maturity. Because one of the things about maturity that we find is this deep roots that mature leaders have. One of the big evidences of that is great leaders from a non-egotistical position have a good friendship with themselves. They do not hack themselves apart. They do not inordinately blame themselves. Instead, they kindly deal with the truth and know that if they're going to lead people and take that risk of stepping out front, they need to have an inner well of confidence that's based on a friendly and warm relationship with themselves.
Let me try to take that concept and turn it into a day-to-day. Would you agree with me when we find those leaders who blame themselves, it often manifests into working long hours, being chaotic, just crazy. They take on all of the responsibility themselves. They hardly ever return voicemails, hardly ever return emails. When we do get to talk with them, their hair is on fire and their shirt's all disheveled, and you can see it in them physically, emotionally, and spiritually. You can see that they're bankrupt in the sense of they burn the candle at all ends and everything in between. And I know both you and I know a leader who runs an extraordinarily busy EMS system out on the East Coast in a very difficult competitive area, was in a very active role during 9/11, but yet when we talk with that leader and ask him how things are going, he's so calm.
Yeah.
He's relaxed. And we both know his day is busy from sun up to sundown. Yes. We know that he's regularly out talking to the troops and talking to his leaders and balancing power in politics, because it's a large healthcare system that has the complexity of large healthcare systems. But he brings calm to his life. He brings calm to his leadership. He brings all of that by not making it his fault, knowing that's work to do and work that the team needs to do and work that he needs to do. But I often find, and I wonder if you agree, that often that taking it all on their own shoulders turns into working themselves emotionally, spiritually, physically to death.
Yeah, the way I like to frame it is I'll never be fully matured. My maturing is always a process, and where I am right now is okay. So if we can just give ourselves both the opportunity to relentlessly learn, and also the grace to accept ourselves and who we are, then we can begin to lead. Well, what a great topic, Aarron. Thank you so much for bringing this up. It was a lot of fun.
And it just started with a simple question.
Right.
Well, likewise, I really appreciate the great conversation, John. I really appreciate everyone who spent some time with us today. And to build upon John's closing comments, is that piece of not only accepting where we're at, but as you were saying, John, accepting who we are. Yes. Accept that we will fall victim to blame, that we will have path dependency, that we will attribute things because we're human. But we'll do our own work, we'll rise above, and that we'll realize that as leaders, it is the journey, not the destination.
Great. Well,
thanks, John.
Thank you. Anybody wants to reach out to us, we're happy to talk to you. Thank you for attending, and look forward to seeing you next month.